Hey guys, I'm Pedram, surgical resident from Melbourne. Welcome back to this video series on how to pass the GSSE. In this particular video, we're going to be talking about your approach to study. Specifically, we'll be talking about study tactics. We'll break down my particular study plan. We'll talk about how you can approach studying for anatomy, pathology, and physiology and how to break your time up between those. Talk about group study versus alone study, as well as broader time management techniques. Let's get started. There are two broad tactics for tackling GSSE study. The first is to use a questions first approach, where you go through the bank questions and use them to dictate what you're going to learn. And the second is to use a more of a subject-based approach, where you go through the different components of the GSSE, anatomy, pathology, physiology, go through individual subjects or topics within those, and then go and do questions after you've learned some information on those particular topics. I personally prefer the questions first method. My primary reason for this is that the topics or components of the GSSE, so anatomy, pathology, and physiology, are so vast and so broad that for me to sit down and properly go through any of those components is going to take me a lot of time. So I find it a more efficient use of my time to use the questions to guide what I need to know and the types of topics and the depth that I need to know them in. So, the biggest benefit of using this method is that you've got directed learning based on questions that have appeared on the GSSE in the past. Overall, this means that you're studying smarter, not harder, and theoretically reduces your time commitment to studying. One of the downsides to using this particular method is that you end up learning in silos. So you've got all these pockets of knowledge based on the concepts that you've been exposed to in the questions from the question bank, but there are lots of gaps in your knowledge which you would otherwise have if you had gone through the chapter-based or systems-based method. The other con to this is that your learning can sometimes be a little bit disjointed. So for example, if you're going through the upper limb anatomy questions, and one question that you read is on the quadrangular space, so you go and spend some time learning about the quadrangular space, but then the next question is on the structures and relations of the cubital fossa, you've suddenly jumped from shoulder region down to your elbow region, and you've kind of missed some stuff in between. So if your head has been geared towards learning about the shoulder and you want to try and consolidate that knowledge, and suddenly the next question is about the cubital fossa, you need to be willing to either skip past that question and go back and find some more shoulder related questions, or change tact and go and learn about the cubital fossa. This is what I mean by it can sometimes be a little bit disjointed in your learning. One way to counteract having these silos of knowledge would be to continue to do more and more and more questions. The more questions that you encounter, the more likely it is that you're going to come across new concepts, and then you'll force yourself to learn those new concepts. This is why I would probably advocate for having another question bank that you can go through. Another possible downside to using the questions first approach is that if you are the type of person who, if you do question practice exams and you start getting questions wrong, and that's a little bit of a hit to your confidence, you're going to feel that quite a lot, especially when you first start studying for the GSSE using this questions first approach, because you wouldn't have been exposed to GSSE style questions in the past, and it's not unreasonable for you to get them wrong. You just need to keep reminding yourself that, especially on your first attempt, getting questions wrong is not reflective of what you will be like in the actual exam, and should hopefully actually motivate you to learn more, because you'll be able to repeat the questions in the future and hopefully get them right. Now, just touching briefly on the alternative study method, which is using the textbooks and going through them individually and then going on to do questions, you're probably going to be a lot more knowledgeable come the end of it, but the time commitment required to do that is insane. So that's why I would advocate for a questions first approach when it comes to your study. Let's break down my particular study plan. Now, my study plan, as you can see here, is a 22-week study plan with around about 18 weeks dedicated to active learning and around about 4 weeks dedicated to revision. Now, keep in mind that revision is constantly ongoing. If I was to spend 18 weeks learning purely new content and not revising any of the content that I had learned, especially in the earlier weeks, then by the time I reach my revision point, I have to restart learning everything from the former weeks, from the earlier weeks. The order of my particular study plan was based on the order of lectures or the order of content that we were given in the Diploma of Anatomy course. I quite like this particular order, but obviously you can turn it around and switch it up for whatever your strengths or weaknesses are. you'll note that there are certain weeks or certain topics that have a larger number of weeks allocated to them. So for example, the abdomen and the pelvis have more than 1 week allocated to them because they are generally large topics to cover. Again, based on your weaknesses and your strengths, you can change this around so that you are focusing on your areas of weakness. I color-coded my particular study plan so that I knew exactly where I was up to, and this is particularly important if you are doing the whole active learning as well as revising both at the same time. So throughout the 22 weeks, I would have seen that there were certain weeks where or certain topics that I had covered more than once, and some topics that I hadn't covered at all. You need to keep in mind that you will never feel fully prepared. Regardless of how structured you make your study plan, there will be times where you fall behind, which is why it's a good idea to try and keep ahead if you can. So trying to push yourself to be a little bit ahead of the curve, because you will come towards hurdles, come towards speed bumps in your studying journey where you're going to start falling behind because you don't have the chance to study, whether they be really bad shifts at work or a stretch of shifts at work, which means that you can't really study, family commitments, personal commitments, or just things that come up. There will be days where you can't study or weeks where you can't study. So if you try to stay ahead of the curve, then you have a little bit of a buffer so that you're not mentally distressed when it does come to those days. But having said all that, you will never feel fully prepared to sit your GSSE, so don't try to aim for that. Because anatomy was probably my weakest point from medical school, I chose to always tackle the anatomy side of things first. I also found that anatomy, because I had resources that I really enjoyed, such as the 3D Anatomy Atlas, I really enjoyed studying the anatomy portion. So again, that would set me up nicely for that week so that I would finish that particular part of the anatomy, get a little bit of motivation for the fact that I've already finished one part of the study for that week, and then move on to all of the pathology and physiology for that particular bodily system. Okay. Let's talk about how you can structure your study sessions. And I think the way that you structure your study sessions should be dependent on how much time you have to study. So we're going to break this down into less than 60 minutes to study, 60 to 20 minutes to study, and more than 120 minutes to study. If you've got less than 60 minutes to study, it should largely, I think, be revision, as that amount of time is not really long enough to learn and to properly understand new bits of information. So use this time to go through content that you've already covered, go through the bank questions, or watch a video that you found helpful in the past, just to reiterate that information and seal it in. If you've got about 60 to 120 minutes, I think the majority of my session blocks or study session blocks were around about this period of time. I would tackle the question bank questions, and this is new question bank questions, so things that you've not previously seen, with a little bit of light reading. And you can cover a couple of key concepts here. You can also use this time to watch some shorter YouTube videos as well, and I think that rounds out this study session nicely. So in my 60 to 120 minute sessions is where I learned the bulk of my content. Now, if you've got more than 2 hours in a particular study block, this is great for deep diving into concepts that you find difficult to understand. So for me, that was revisiting things like the coagulation cascade, the inflammation cascade, learning about cellular activity, things that I haven't really touched on in years since my early medical school. And I could sit down and watch hour-long lectures on it. So for example, watching the Ninja Nerd lectures, which are typically a little bit longer than your average YouTube video. So really sitting down, going through those, revisiting West's physiology. I use this time a lot to cover pathology and physiology, which were, in hindsight, my areas of weakness when it came to studying for the GSSE, because the anatomy resources that I had were a lot more useful or a lot more complete. I would suggest using something like a Pomodoro timer. So you may have heard of this particular technique before, the Pomodoro technique, where you set aside within an hour, say 45 minutes of studying and then 15 minutes of rest, and you can choose whatever ratio you want. Obviously, you want the studying portion to be significantly larger than the rest portion, in an attempt to try and prevent mental fatigue and prevent you from losing concentration. So use that time, use the 45 minutes to study, and then in that 15 minutes, you're going to be checking your messages or taking a break, going for a walk, having a coffee, etc. I found that to be particularly helpful. Now, in a given day, I might study for up to, say, 8 hours, such as on a weekend where I'm not working, but I would still try and split that day up into little study blocks so that I have a little bit of a change of pace throughout the day to keep me from fatiguing and to keep things interesting. And again, depending on how I've split up the blocks, I would do different types of work. In terms of how you should split your time between studying for anatomy, physiology, and pathology, this partly comes down to your strengths and weaknesses, but also partly I think it should come down to where people fail the most. So based on my understanding and from what I've heard, the majority of people who fail end up failing on the pathology or the physiology section rather than the anatomy section. Keep in mind the anatomy section is worth 50% of the exam, but if you fail any individual component such as pathology or physiology, then you overall fail the exam. With that in mind, I would probably recommend spending the majority of your time studying for the pathology and the physiology sections. So for myself, I would try and split it up into around about 40% physiology, 30 to 40% pathology, and then the rest of the time would be anatomy. Now, this is based on the fact that I did the Diploma of Surgical Anatomy, and that provided me with ongoing study throughout the time that I was studying for the GSSE, so ongoing revision, for the GSSE, and I felt that I didn't need to do too much more by way of anatomy study in order to prepare myself for the GSSE. If you aren't confident in anatomy, or if you haven't done extra courses, you may want to spend a little bit more time on that anatomy and even it out a little bit more. But keep in mind that the majority of the people fail on pathology and physiology from what I've heard, so I would probably recommend spending a little bit more time there. I also find the concepts of pathology and physiology a little bit more difficult to grasp compared to anatomy, where anatomy is typically understanding the attachments of muscles, the courses of nerves and arteries. It's not that difficult a concept to understand. Maybe embryology is a little bit more difficult and more conceptual. However, pathology and physiology are often much more conceptual and therefore, for myself, a little bit more difficult to understand than anatomy is, and hence why I would give more time to them. In terms of structuring your study with regards to whether you study alone or in a group, this is largely personal preference. My preference is to study alone because I believe that group study sessions often more rapidly deteriorate into inefficient study compared to studying alone. One of the difficulties with group study for the GSSE is that often everyone in the group is working full-time still, and therefore, given that we all work shift work, it's quite difficult to find a time in the week where you're always all going to be available. With that in mind, I would probably recommend a smaller group rather than a larger group, and you guys try to figure out some kind of a time, for example, late on a Sunday evening where it's most likely that you're all going to be at home to go through things together. I wouldn't recommend going through individual questions together because I don't think that's a particularly good use of time. What I would recommend is going through difficult concepts together. So not in the typical way where you assign someone a topic and they create a PowerPoint presentation on it, but perhaps prior to meeting, you guys come up with a list of concepts that are difficult for you guys to grasp or has been difficult to grasp in the last week. You get there and you all discuss it and you actively learn through your group discussions. Now, I actually did this for myself. I created a Google document called Unclear Questions, and in it, I would document all the questions that I'd attempted where I didn't understand the answer to that particular question, or I disagreed with the answer. Intermittently, I would go back and I would do deep dives on these questions in an attempt to try and figure out where my knowledge gaps are. I found this really beneficial because over the course of time, I was documenting the concepts that I was having difficulty understanding, and I could use this document to spark discussions with my friends who are also sitting the GSSE. So this is what I would recommend you guys do if you are having group sessions. Studying alone, obviously you need to keep track of yourself and you need to be able to motivate yourself because other people may not be there to do so. So that's one of the downsides to studying alone. And you also need to make sure that your attention is focused. So if you're the type of person who gets distracted really easily, then perhaps doing a group study session might be a little bit easier or a little bit better because other people can keep you accountable. But overall, I would probably advocate for a hybrid kind of mixture where you're doing the majority of your study alone and then you find time where you intimately meet with your friends who are also sitting the GSSE to discuss difficult concepts. In terms of broader time management, I found that in the 22 weeks that I was studying between around about 3 to 6 days a week, depending on my work schedule and my other commitments. And each of those days where I was studying, I would be studying for between 1 to 8 hours a day. Now that would be broken up into the blocks that we've talked about previously. You need to keep in mind that the real study only really begins after you've paid for the exam and you've put down $4,500 and you feel the pressure to start studying for this exam. You need to be mindful not to pick up too many extra things, too many extra commitments, and you may end up finding that you're putting aside some of your other commitments such as hobbies or research or spending extra time with family or friends in order to keep on top of your study. So I would recommend for the period of, or whatever period of study that you choose, making sure that the GSSE is higher up on your priority list rather than trying to juggle everything all at once. If you try to juggle everything all at once, then you'll probably burn out a lot sooner. Your study won't be as efficient and you'll probably be less happy because you're not really doing any of your commitments justice. So bear that in mind. It's a bit of a slog. It's not going to be a sprint. It's going to be more of a marathon. So you need to pace yourself throughout the time and make sure that you're not overcommitting. That's it for this particular video. We'll see you in the next one where we discuss more tips and tricks on how to pass the GSSE. Thanks.